Welcome, LA Progressive friends, family, and readers. Today, Dick and I are delighted to have with us Norman Solomon, who so many of you progressives know. He definitely has all of his progressive credentials. He's the National Director of RootsAction.org and the Executive Director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. His most recent book, War Made Visible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine, was published in this past June 2023 by the New Press. And we're going to sit down and talk to Norm a little bit about his book and an article that he recently published with the LA Progressive. Hi, Norm.
So glad to be with you.
Awesome. So, Dick, why don't you start?
Well, so as a Vietnam veteran, that has a long time been one of my complaints. We learned all the wrong lessons in Vietnam. We learned how to keep our war secret, keep it out of people's eyes, because of the thought that the journalism that went on during Vietnam actually helped end the war, and I think that's no doubt true. Now, by embedding the journalists in with military units, it essentially muzzles them. And so Daniel Ellsberg talked about that. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, really, I think it was a slow progression from obsequious stenography from journalists in the early part of the Vietnam War to gradually, in large part because of the pressure of grassroots opposition to the war that organized and grew, the realities of the war began to come through. There's a study by Daniel Hallen, who wrote a book called The Uncensored War, where he actually went back and looked at the TV footage of the Vietnam War. And of course, back then there were 3 TV networks. And surprisingly, there was actually very little coverage of the suffering, the battles, the actual human cost on either side of that war. But gradually there began to be a bit more because of the organizing. And journalism I think of as kind of cracks in a wall. There is a wall, mainstream media, corporate dominated, and then journalists, when they're really on their game and doing what they should be doing, they poke holes in the wall and they challenge this idea that journalism is simply to tell us what the government wants us to know. So it's a tough battle. And, fast forward to 2023, and it's still a big struggle. And authentic journalism obviously is in short supply in mainstream corporate media, including NPR News, PBS NewsHour, and so forth. All the more reason that we need to support, this is an unsolicited plug, LA Progressive and other independent media outlets, because that's the way that news gets out, that analysis grows, and ultimately that affects mainstream coverage also.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving that plug,
Sure.
giving us that plug. So, I remember, so Dick was in Vietnam, and I have memories of, I'm a few years younger than Dick, so I was a child, but I do have memories of watching the evening news and seeing the footage that was captured with the embedded journalists there in Vietnam. But it seems to me that nowadays, you just, as much as the United States, and this is basically, this is what you've written about in your book, as much as the United States has been engaged in all kinds of military actions, most Americans wouldn't have a clue if you rely on the news to keep you informed. So let's talk about some of those engagements.
Yeah, most Americans are clueless by intention of the mass media, certainly by intention of the government that mass media largely replicates and amplifies. We were taught, I remember in civics class, that democracy is the informed consent of the governed. But if you don't have informed consent, it's not really consent at all. And in the case of, and Dick, you started out by asking about Daniel Ellsberg, he really shattered the kind of invisible wall, you might say, that kept vital information about the realities of the war, the real goals of the war, and the absolute contempt that the war planners in Washington had for civilians. And there's an echo right now in terms of what's going on in Gaza, where in Washington, despite the lip service, we really have a failure of elected officials and their appointees to really talk about, in human terms, what's happening in a war. And I remember hearing Daniel Ellsberg talk about that one of the aspects of the 7,000 pages of top secret documents in the Pentagon Papers that blew his mind is he saw no discussion of how the war was affecting people in Vietnam. Whereas the rhetoric was, oh, we're there to, help and save and support the people of Vietnam. So here we are in the tail end of 2023. And despite the occasional throwaway lines in the lip service, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Vice President Kamala Harris, President Biden, the actual decision making is contemptuous of the people who are suffering, who are mourning their loved ones, who are maimed, who are being terrorized by really part of the US war machine. And I've been thinking about that a lot, given the subtitle of my book, War Made Invisible, is how America hides the human toll of its military machine. And it's hidden in plain sight that the so-called Israel Defense Forces, and it's about as much defense as the US Defense Department is, it's hidden in plain sight that this is a force that is absolutely contemptuous of human life in Gaza, and also that the Israeli so-called defense force is part of the US war machine. I mean, even as we speak, 20,000 civilians already confirmed dead in Gaza. The US is shipping more weaponry. There's as I talk about in the book, an extraordinary 10-year deal, 3.8 billion with a B dollars every year in military aid, automatically hot-wired, shipped from the United States, provided to Israel. But that's not enough. Even while the slaughter is taking place, and now the disease predictably setting in, which the UN says might kill even more people than the bombs, we have a situation where the Congress is in the process of approving a White House proposal for around $14 billion more of military weaponry. So this is a death culture that we live in, and it's motivated by, sometimes unconsciously, not only the profit motive, the tremendous profiteering from these weapons, but the ethnocentric bias, the racism, the religious bias, the zeal to dominate different regions of the world. So as we speak here, close to the end of this year, it's hard to be upbeat, but where I do think we can find encouragement is the demonstrations, the protests, the speaking out, and the media outlets that we are creating as progressives to turn all this around.
So obviously Daniel Ellsberg is renowned for the release of the Pentagon Papers, which to me, the heart of that said that the leaders of our war effort at that time knew the war was unwinnable and just persisted anyway for who knows what reason, but cost 10,000 more American GIs and how many hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese, we'll never know. But then, as you point out in this article, Ellsberg then spent decades warning about, raising the alarm about nuclear war. And the three of us have spent our lives under the cloud of nuclear holocaust. I remember as a kid, my dad having a brief conversation about putting a bunker in the backyard. He was in the Army Reserves. We sort of laughed it off and went on. But now, we sort of blithely talk about the possibility that the Ukraine war will cause nuclear war. We play with the idea that we'll have some kind of war with China, which would, destroy half the people in the world. And obviously what's going on in Israel and Gaza, it's right on the verge. And yet, we just sort of, that's just how the world is, and we don't raise much alarm about it.
Well, we're encouraged not to raise alarm about it. And one of the key connections that is severed, that's not acknowledged, is between so-called conventional war and the potential for global catastrophic nuclear war. Even the Vietnam War, we later learned Nixon was seriously considering using nuclear weapons on North Vietnam, and only, we learned, because of massive protests in late 1969 was he dissuaded because of what he considered not the human cost, but the political cost is what mattered. And as you mentioned, the war in Ukraine, very little coverage in US news media, as there's this attitude, oh, we're very moral in the United States. Let's you and them fight, you Ukrainians, and die. And the increased chances of nuclear war get very short shrift in that respect. I remember right after the invasion by Russia, which I think we should condemn, the State of the Union address from President Biden was more than 6,000 words. Didn't mention nuclear war once, the danger of nuclear war, the use of nuclear weapons. It's as though if we don't talk about it, we're reducing the dangers, when actually the opposite is the case. We have three major treaties that have been abrogated and withdrawn from by the US in this century. By Bush, for instance, the ABM treaty, George W. Bush, and then Trump pulled out of a couple of them. The Open Skies Treaty for surveillance and inspection, which was a wonderful bilateral treaty between the US and Russia. And then the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which abolished an entire class of medium range missiles in Europe, a tremendous triumph for the anti-war and anti-nuclear movement on both ends of the Atlantic in the 1980s, abrogated, withdrawn from by President Trump. And what's really notable as well, and progressives should really be outraged about this, is that after those treaties were canceled unilaterally by the US, making nuclear war more likely, then came in President Obama, didn't lift a finger to try to reinstate those treaties. Then later in came, as we now have, President Biden. Hardly a word about, for instance, restoring the INF Treaty. So this, I think, goes to that point that out of sight, out of mind is extremely dangerous. And one of the many aspects of these dangers that I learned about by reading Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, and from being able to talk with him, is that we need to abolish, we need to shut down ICBMs. And without going into great detail, there's 400 of them right now in 5 Western US states, 400 missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles with massive capacity to initiate a nuclear war that would, according to the latest studies about nuclear winter, being able to, after a thermonuclear exchange, wipe out agriculture on the planet, would kill about 98 to 99% of the humans on this planet. And long story short, those are the only weapons, the ICBMs, that are on tripwire hair trigger alert because they're land-based, unlike the air and sea, and they're vulnerable to attack. So there's sort of a use them or lose them mindset that's inherent. Well, people say you can't have unilateral disarmament. That would turn you into a sitting duck. It's really the opposite is the case. And I use this example. Let's say we're standing in a pool of gasoline, and our purported adversary is also sitting in the same pool of gasoline, and we're all lighting matches. Well, if we proposed, let's stop lighting matches, we could be told, oh, that's unilateral disarmament, you wimp. Don't you want to stand up for freedom and protect ourselves, when actually the opposite is the case?
Wow. In your article, you talk about the book Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War, where Daniel Ellsberg quotes Friedrich Nietzsche, "Madness in individuals is something rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs, it is the rule." And it appears that that is true. I mean, this is so insane. I mean, I don't even know if there's a question here.
Yeah. Yeah. It's such a tremendous challenge because us human beings, whether we're living in the United States or elsewhere, we're on, was it Buckminster Fuller called it Spaceship Earth, but whatever we want to call it, this wondrous, beautiful planet. And there is an insanity of nuclear weapons and the governments that are brandishing them. And terrorism on the most ultimate scale is to threaten to blow up the world. And we know that after the Russians invaded Ukraine, there was a lot of bad press, as there should have been, against Vladimir Putin, strongly implying he would consider using nuclear weapons to introduce nuclear weapons into the conflict. What we didn't hear from US media is that is established doctrine that has always existed since 1945. The United States government has also openly had as its military doctrine, we reserve the right to be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. Well, that's something fundamental. And somewhat parenthetically, when he was running for president last time, Biden said that he would change that, but they had what they call the nuclear posture review that he signed off on and reinforced as US policy, and that's still the same policy. So that's an example of a kind of a madness. And Martin Luther King Jr., when he described the Vietnam War and what it was part of, he used the phrase the madness of militarism. Whether in 1967 or today, I think it's quite an appropriate description.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly rely on this war economy to keep us afloat. I mean, just right here in Southern California, we have so many weapons manufactured, big, large Department of Defense contractors, and so many people live lives as if they are not part of this. But so many of us rely on it just for our every day-to-day jobs.
Absolutely. It's part of the unhinged aspect of corporate capitalism that military spending is a really inefficient way to create jobs, dollar for job. And you look at what can be done with similar amounts of money in the medical care field, in education, and create way more jobs. The studies are really clear. And yet, it's the irrationality for human beings, but the rationality for profit taking, the cost plus contracts and so forth. Places like Raytheon and Donald Douglas and Boeing, they never lose a war. Even though the US, quote unquote, lost the war in Afghanistan. No, this was great. This was great for corporate capitalism. And so I think it's an opportunity for us to spotlight that irrationality. It's sort of like who? Who benefits? Who's the us? What do we mean when we say this policy is good for us? Well, it's good for this small sector of the population that's profiteering. We have war profiteering as an economy. And when you've got about half of the discretionary budget of the United States going into military purposes, it's part of that death culture that progressives and others who see what the hell's going on are challenging.
So about the threat of nuclear holocaust, presidents can do something about it. Senators, representatives, diplomats can do something about it. Experts like you and Daniel Ellsberg can raise the alarm. But what can everyday people like Sharon and I do to stop that insanity?
Well, part of what the two of you are doing is the terrific LA Progressive website because the flow of information 365 every day of the year is really crucial. You know, it's like working part of the garden. Nobody can work the whole garden. There's so many aspects to it. I think the information flow is important. The lobbying is important as well. We're too nice to members of Congress. We have people who do some nice things. There are representatives in the House, for instance, and we tend to be way too deferential. Even though they're part of the warfare state, they're reinforcing this terrible threat to humanity through their appropriations. And too often we just let them off the hook. We should be politely, assertively, nonviolently, and militantly in their face and say, look, we are upset about this. If you don't change, we can launch nonviolent civil disobedience campaigns if need be. We can certainly picket your offices. We can call out for what you are. And at rootsaction.org, we've been sponsoring something called Defuse Nuclear War, and people can sign up there on our website. It's diffusenuclearwar.org. We've organized several national decentralized actions. For instance, during the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis last year. And sometimes we've had in 30 or 40 different cities and towns on the same day, picket lines at various congressional offices. And so that's just an example of what can be done. If we sit back and wait for people in Washington to solve this problem, we're on a fool's errand. We are trusting those who should not be trusted. It's true of every other advance. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movements of the past, the gay rights movement, so many others, women's rights, they were never handed down from on high. They also always, they had to come from the grassroots, and the end of the chain is those in power, not the beginning, because as Frederick Douglass said, power never concedes without a struggle. It's not going to happen unless we force it to happen. And that means grassroots organizing.
Well, that's a great note for us to end on, Norm Solomon. Thank you so much for sharing this great information. And also, you know, you said something about President Nixon having in mind to use nuclear weaponry during Vietnam, but it was the activists and the threat of somehow his political career being harmed that changed his mind. And I think that that's sort of the light at the end of the tunnel. We see that activism does make a difference. And so thank you for providing us with information. And is there any last word that you'd like to say before we end?
Oh, well, thank you. And the light that you referred to, the light that's ahead of us, is really hard sometimes for us to see or to keep flickering because of corporate media and the blather coming from elected officials. But that's the light that keeps us going. It's the light that our ancestors at their best have followed to create a better world. So as Antonio Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. And right now we have a lot of reasons for pessimism, but it's the optimism of the will that's going to create a better future.
Well, thank you, Norman. This was wonderful. We'll be back to you in the future.
Looking forward. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for sticking around. If you like the LA Progressive content and the discussions we have here, please consider clicking the subscribe button below and also give us a thumbs up. That helps to grow our audience by feeding the algorithm, which helps to get this content in front of more eyes. Thanks for stopping by. We really appreciate your support.